Hello, this is Sri Chalapa with Engagedly, and we are doing our monthly webinar series on people strategy. Today, we're going to talk about the secret sauce for leading transformational change, which is actually a book that was led as with Ian Ziskin, who's the president of Excel Group, and had many co-authors, leading thought leaders in the space, and I'm joined with them as well. So I'll just start with the initial round of introductions. Ian is the president of Excel Group, has 40 years of experience as a business leader, board advisor, member, coach, consultant, entrepreneur, teacher, speaker, and author. He's a co-founder and partner of Business Insight Group, co-founder of the Consortium of Change, also called C4C, and co-founder of Create Project, CHREATE Project. His global leadership experience includes chief human resources officer and other leadership roles in 3 Fortune 100 companies, including Northrop Grumman, Quest Communication, and TRW. I also am joined with Rebecca Ferrer, who's the principal consultant of Princeton HR Insight LLC, is a seasoned HR executive who has been consistently recognized for innovative solutions that drive alignment and deliver results. She has coached hundreds of executives and teams to understand how motivation and different management styles can positively impact performance to accelerate effectiveness. Her approach focuses on identifying areas of impact and designing and delivering programs that link HR actions to business strategy. You're speaking my language there, Rebecca, to ensure that goals are achieved, initiatives are sustained, and the company is ready to meet future demands. Lacey Leon McLaughlin, principal and executive coach at LLM Consulting Group, brings 20 years of experience to our executive coaching and talent management consulting practice. Lacey has worked with clients across all industries and sizes, including aerospace, automotive, entertainment, media, professional services, retail, and technology, ranging from entrepreneurial-led startups to global Fortune 100 companies. Cheryl Perkins, CEO and founder of Innovation Edge LLC, is a thought leader with over 35 years of experience in innovation and as a business strategy expert. Prominent keynote speaker, published author, and creative catalyst in brand building initiatives. That's awesome. We have such a strong brain power here. My computer might explode. But thank you so much for joining us. I am really excited to have you. This is such an important one, especially with the changing environment. Transformation is almost like a constant now. And obviously, we all want to know what the secret sauce is. But I'll start with an open question, and any of you can maybe start with the response here. But really, what drove you to write this book at this time? Like, what was the motivation for doing that?
Maybe I'll go ahead and start, if I could, Sri. Thanks for having us. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. As the lead author, I had a point of view in getting the book started, and I'm sure all my friends will chime in with their motivations as well. For me, it was a combination of two things, really. One was, sitting around in the middle of COVID, watching what was happening in the world in terms of, pretty large-scale transformational change that people were going through. Not only, obviously, the health-related aspects of COVID, but economic uncertainty, people trying to figure out how to work remotely, literally overnight. Same thing with kids going to school remotely, literally overnight, and even some of the political discord that was going on, not only in the United States, but around the world, all happening kind of at the same time, made me stop and think about what does it take to survive or even thrive in periods of large-scale transformational change. So that was a big motivator for me. The second one is being a co-founder of this consortium for change that you mentioned, along with Lacey, who's on the panel as well. When we started it a few years ago, we were trying to create this environment of high degree of collaboration and working together on a variety of different projects among the many members, coaches, consultants, transformational change experts in our community network. And we wanted to build something, including this book, in a highly collaborative way and try to bring as many voices into the discussion as possible. So I've grown fond recently of calling this book 200 Voices in Under 200 Pages, because what we've tried to do is get a high degree of input from a very wide and experienced group of people, but do it in as practical and focused a way as possible, given the fact that a lot of people say nobody reads books anymore. So those were a couple of the major motivators for me in pulling the book together. But let me see if maybe Lacey, I'll ask you to chime in first. When you think about it from your perspective, any other motivations that I didn't touch on?
Yeah, I think from a personal perspective, it was a great opportunity to bring people together and work together, collaborate in a time where we weren't all engaging all that much in a way that we were used to and consistent with COVID. So for me, it was about creating community and network in a time where people were feeling disconnected, and then also bringing some consistency and a voice of consistency to a group of people that were working really hard in a very challenging time. So 2 benefits. 1, working with a group of people that I like working with, and really putting some great content in the world that maybe brought a bit of voice of calm and an understanding that as leaders and people in business, you weren't alone.
Yeah, I want to build off that because everyone was pivoting, as we all know. And myself being an advocate for strategy innovation, a lot of people were struggling with how to make the change during COVID. And so I saw it as not only a unique opportunity to collaborate with colleagues or people that have driven transformational change, but really help them navigate the change. So provide the right tools and templates in terms of how to make something happen so that it had a positive and lasting impact during a time where a lot of things were pretty negative. So there was a lot of momentum from my perspective, as well as with my team, to just really provide and help the navigation through a terrible, rough time.
I would add something similar to what Lacey and Cheryl were just saying of, change starts with yourself. And so as much as we were getting a record number of calls in 2020 to help organizations and leaders through this transformational change with everything unfolding, we were also going through that. So 1, to have a community of people who are experts in this space to help our clients, to bring this information forward and embed it in our client work. And 2, so that we were managing our own change using some of these tools, I thought was very valuable as the information started unfolding.
Yeah. So when you think about transformational change, what were some of the key, and maybe each one of you can add or build upon, what are some of the key takeaways that you learned from successful people you studied or you talked to or you worked with that were able to execute this transformation effectively?
Yeah, I'm glad to start talking about that. I think the one thing that's unique about this book, to Ian's point, is the 200 voices. We talked to a lot of leaders, a lot of proven leaders that have done a lot of things to make things work. And, a couple of them that we've highlighted focused on the importance of kind of bringing everyone in from the beginning. Like, the one thing with transformation is you can't do it alone. It's a journey and you need others to be along. And what we have found as we did our interviews and wrote our essays around transformational change, that one common theme that stands out is that you need to foster innovation at every level. So you need to share your vision out there with individuals throughout the organization. You need to identify those advocates and engage those employees that can help you create, what you want to create. So they need to understand where you are today versus the vision of where you're going, and have those organizational advocates or champions throughout there. So we have a couple interviews in the book, one by Myra Kim, CEO and owner of American Solar, as well as Bob Sheminsky, who previously was at Con Ed, and they emphasized empowering others to really help innovate and collaborate. So the main thing to me is you need the team, you need the resources. They will flourish as well as transformational flourishing if you bring them on early.
Cheryl, if I can build on your empowering others. So you saw some organizations, when all these changes were hitting, they hunkered down and they wanted kind of one size fits all approaches, and other organizations sort of decentralized decision making. And from my experience and even kind of researching and crowdsourcing for this book is there's vulnerability moments in life. Sometimes they're individual. It's a health crisis. It's a divorce. It's a loss of a job, whatever it is. Sometimes it's collective, 9/11, Kennedy assassination, that type of thing. But we were going through this collective vulnerability moment for a somewhat extended period of time, maybe still are, but if you're going back to when this book started coming together. And when managers were empowered to meet people where they are and come up with solutions that fit that moment, right? Kids are at home, or, somebody's in a nursing center and you don't have access to them, or all those things. What you ended up doing is creating the foundation of trust that you could then build on. You trusted that manager to lead you through change. You trusted that company to be there for you. And to me, that foundation of trust happens ahead of when people are really going to commit to the transformational change. And so I think where organizations sent that power down to the managers and the employees and those conversations happened well, it worked out a lot better. And you're seeing it now where those companies, some of those individuals are loyal and they're staying with companies. They're not resigning. They're continuing to juggle for these companies. And so now that we're a couple years into this, we're starting to see the curve and how this is playing out with companies who made decisions a couple years ago in this change space.
Yeah. I would just add to that across the board, transformation is hard. Across the board, transformation was harder during the years of COVID. And as Rebecca said, and I call it a little bit different, but I think what we saw was sort of grace and humanity in a way that leaders hadn't been vulnerable to show in the past, right? Yeah. So before, they put their heads down, they had a business focus, they had a business driver, and they took action, right? And they hopefully brought people along, and maybe they lost some people on the way. And what we saw, and I think what is communicated quite beautifully in the book, is that people kind of lifted up their heads a bit differently, and they stopped and they listened and they learned, and they were human leaders, and they were vulnerable leaders. And that led to some really amazing moments that we're continuing to see today. So where I think building from the top down is hugely important, communication and innovation, all of those things, so important, and leaders were leading differently.
And it's interesting, you're seeing some companies stay there and continue with that new learning.
Absolutely.
And you're seeing some companies flip back to where they were a few years ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Let's see what wins out, or if it sort of finds its way back into the middle.
Well, the other thing that got my attention as I was learning from all of these different stories and leaders that we were including in the book to build on everything that's been said so far, is just the importance of truth and defining reality. The situation is what it is. We are where we are as an individual or as a team or as an organization or even as a society. And you learn a lot about the human capacity for denying and deflecting and dismissing data or facts that do not reinforce our preferred view of the internal or external environment. People have become very good at that. We saw it with COVID because in many cases people were, either moving too slowly to face the reality, or once they realized that COVID wasn't going away anytime soon, they started redefining the facts and the circumstances to fit, what they prefer. But most transformational change really begins and ends almost with the confrontation of the reality and the circumstance that the leader is facing. And one of the most important contributions I think that effective leaders seem to make in all of these stories that we learned from was that they helped other people see the truth and face the truth of what actually had to be confronted, rather than burying their heads in the sand and therefore losing valuable time. And that really stuck out for me.
Yeah, I think one thing, one of you were talking about trusting your people to execute on it, but I would say that only happens, right, if the leader is trusted as well. So if they were not being authentic, or they had not been perceived as authentic in the past, that's a harder transformation, because you can't trust your people to do the things if they don't trust you, if what you're saying is not what you mean, it's not what you're doing, your actions are not authentic. So I think that obviously successful leaders probably have that in common, is that they were trusted leaders in their organization.
There's actual work in the essays and interviews talking exactly about that, you can't expect people to follow, you blindly. You have to nurture those relationships and make the real connections so that people in the organization actually share the vision and it becomes their vision. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that's a proven thing, that you need to nurture those relationships to a point where they take on the vision as their own.
Right. And one thing that, Ian, I think you when we talked previously, mentioned about, getting the reality and being grounded in reality and accepting it, but doesn't necessarily mean you resign to the fact that all is lost, but you just define what that is. And then you talked about knowing, going from what to what. Can you talk a little bit more about, or any of you talk a little bit more about, what does that journey imply, and what does it mean for people who are going through this transformation, or thinking about maybe transformations in the future?
Yeah. I'll start with that one, because that was one of the things that was most important for me in the book, and then others can chime in with their own personal stories or what they learned from some of the leaders they talked to. I say, in the book, the single most important question to be answered in successfully leading transformational change is from what to what. And what I mean by that is understanding the place that you've been in order to better understand where you're trying to get to in the future. Most individuals and organizations tend to make a common mistake, I find, which is they kind of skip over understanding what got them to this place that they're at right now. Have a tendency not to really understand the successes that need to be preserved. How do you minimize the risk of throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Because they're all focused on the future. We're going to be better when we do the following. And the future orientation is really important in leading change, but not so much so that you forget to answer where you came from and understand what does in fact need to be preserved, so that you don't mess it up along the way to making all the other changes that you're likely about to make. So for me, the framing of from what to what is important for helping an individual, team, or an organization think about the journey that they're about to take. But the journey has to start with understanding the original place you began, not just halfway through thinking about what it is we're going to be doing differently a year from now or 5 years from now. You got to understand your history and kind of respect the history, while at the same time you're falling in love with the future. Both of those things have to happen.
The one thing
Can I build on that with an example? I have a pharma company who's doing some, cutting edge research, and they're in this place where prior decisions are kind of getting in the way of them moving forward. And so the tone in the conversation is frustration of, if we had done this differently 2 years ago, we wouldn't have this headache now. And what you're seeing in the culture is a split between the people that have been there a while and the new leaders coming in. They're getting smarter about saying, we made a decision to go after a certain kind of filing 2 years ago to secure something instead of losing it all. We knew that there would be trade-offs when we got to this point. We are now managing those trade-offs. Let's talk, as a collective team about going forward. So they're getting smarter about that dialogue. But to your point, Ian, if you're not focused on bringing the past forward, you start having this perspective, I think, that turns negative on everyone that came before you, everything that happened before this point, that alienates and doesn't help the culture move forward.
But I would also say it's not just the previous decisions, it's also the behaviors. If we just focus on what to what, and it's about the decisions or circumstances, and we don't address which behaviors we need to keep versus eliminate, then we also can't make the progress we want in the journey. So I think you're right, Rebecca. It is making sure that it's clear, but to Ian's point, like, what do we want to keep on the behaviors, and what do we want to change in order to make the transformation happen? Because it can't just be on decisions alone.
Yeah, the theme is the intentionality. It's the intentionality behind the behaviors. It's the intentionality between the future and the past. It's the intentionality between how people are showing up, the decisions that we're making. That's sort of the theme for me.
Yeah, agree.
The one lesson learned from Lacey's comment about intentionality. It's a common mistake I see made a lot. Particularly new leaders come in to a job. Maybe they've been promoted into it. Perhaps they've been brought in from outside of the organization, but they actually are very intentional about trashing and dismissing everything and everyone that's come before them. You know, it's kind of the new sheriff in town syndrome, where I'm going to prove to everybody that I'm here to fix things, and everything that happened before me wasn't very good. That's usually a bad strategy for successfully leading transformational change, because not only do you alienate all the people who you just inherited, but you also have a tendency to miss out on a lot of the nuggets of success and those things, either behaviors or practices, that need to be preserved because they actually work pretty well. And so I would just encourage anybody who's, you know, listening in on this conversation, be really careful about avoiding that syndrome of new leader comes in and basically wipes out everything and everyone that came before, because it rarely works very effectively.
Right. And I think that's what, Rebecca, you were talking about, right? Because sometimes it may look like in hindsight that the decision was made incorrectly, but they don't know the context of that. You know, it was made in a certain context. If you look at, for example, all the money that was doled out during COVID, I mean, in hindsight, it looks like bad because it's causing inflation, and part of it was probably bad. But if you don't understand the context of which it was done, you know, you will question everything, and then the new leader might be like, I'm cutting everything out, I'm cutting spending, I'm cutting all of this, and then get us back into a different situation that is maybe even worse than where we are right now. So I think context of making decisions is sometimes misunderstood by quote unquote new leaders, where everything the previous leader did is guilty by association, right? So yeah, I think the one thing that really stood out was about this thing about paradoxes, right? And you mentioned like 7 competing priorities and paradoxes. I don't know if there are any ones that, I mean, we don't necessarily have time to talk about all 7 of them, but I'm sure that some of them are more interesting than the others. And we all like, you know, talking about paradoxes. As an engineer myself, I love and science fiction. I love paradoxes. But anyway, I'd like to, you know, maybe see if the panel has any ones that they want to highlight.
Yeah, I'll give maybe a couple of examples, and then others can make up their own because they're all living with them. You know, first, one of the things that became obvious to me was, in order to successfully lead big change, there's this need to reconcile competing priorities, or master paradoxes. You know, in the book, we call it the beauty of and, you know, so it's as opposed to an either or choice, you know, trying to focus on the and. One example of this that really made an impression on me was the reconciliation of facts and feelings. So just to pick up on the theme we were talking about a minute ago, there is this tendency to dismiss facts that don't fit with our preferred view of the world. And that tends to really slow us down in confronting, dealing with, planning for, executing on the need for transformational change. Well, it turns out, you know, facts matter a lot in leading transformational change, but so do feelings, because as it turns out, you know, all the decisions that are being made about what action we're going to take are being made by human beings. And, you know, best example I could think of, it's one I think most of us can relate to, is stepping on a scale and realizing maybe you'd like to lose a bit of weight. You know, the numbers on the scale are staring back at us. It's unambiguous. You know, maybe it's telling us we've got 10 pounds to lose or whatever it is. Most of us intellectually understand that if we're going to lose some weight, it's usually going to be as a result of a combination of diet and exercise, which requires some specific action on our part. However, just because the scale says we probably need to lose 10 pounds, there is no guarantee that we, the individual, are going to be motivated in our head and our heart to actually take the diet and exercise routines that we would normally need to put in place in order to lose the weight. that's all emotionally based. And it's all based on feeling. Do I actually feel motivated to take those actions to lose the weight? And in my experience, it's exactly the same thing with the need for change, because quite often there's data and facts that are staring us as individuals or as organizations in the face. None of that data will change anything. It's really all about us as an individual or as a leader and our willingness to take on, show the courage and take the actions that are required to drive the change. And that's why reconciling these competing priorities, or the paradox of facts and feelings, for me was a pretty good example.
And I'll chime in on we're talking a little bit about it, but reality versus aspiration. Often with transformation, you have a vision and mission of where you want to go, and that's your aspiration. But the reality is, where is the organization? And is the organization ready to actually go after and go to that vision? And to the and part, you need the reality and the aspiration. And often what we found in some of the interviews, or again, just reading some of the essays of others that talk to leaders, is that the aspirations were very high, but the reality was the organization often was not enabled. The capabilities weren't developed. The right skill sets weren't there to meet the aspiration. So again, I think it's important early on for the leader that's leading the change to actually do an assessment of how ready are you to reach the aspiration. And if it's not able to be reached in that first step, readjust the aspiration so it can be reality and aspiration together to start the journey and start getting some successes, versus striving too high and not able to reach that far initially.
I would just add to Cheryl's point, that's at an organization and that's at an individual level. So a lot of times, I think many of us in our consulting work, but a specific example, Ian and I run a development program called Planet, and it's helping leaders be better people leaders to go through all of this. And we start with an assessment that says, what is your likely reputation today? Then we have them go through an exercise that says, what are the words you want to articulate to be the leader that you want to be? What's your personal leadership profile? What's the gap between the two? Now let's step back and teach you the rest of the program so you can figure out which of these tricks and these tools will help you close that gap. And so it's starting with the thing both you and Ian are saying of, what do they want to do? Where is that emotion and motivation going to come from? Okay, now let's teach you the actual techniques, or remind you of techniques you already know, but bring in the techniques that help you close that gap.
Yeah. Intentionality again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, one of the paradoxes that, I don't know if it was one of the ones that in your book, Anna, that I struggled with and I had to reconcile, especially when we're going through transformation during COVID. And as a startup, you're constantly looking at ways to transform and do better, is being agile and being deliberate at the same time. I'm sure that's any transformation, especially the bigger the company, the more deliberate you have to be, but not at the cost of being agile, or at least not at too much of an expense of being agile. Because if you're deliberate and you're constantly deliberating and you never actually make any movement or action, then you're just spinning your wheels and going nowhere. But if you take action without really thoughtfully going through it, you can completely rock the boat and potentially, have all kinds of motivational issues and it could be fatal to an organization as well if you take the wrong action. So that to me is a big paradox that we struggle with, at least as a startup. How do I be deliberate? Because if I'm not deliberate and I go down a certain path, there may be no recovery for a small company like us, right? Because we don't really have the moat like a Coca-Cola has, or Emerson has, or any of those people, where you can make a big mistake and still recover. Any mistake, if it is fairly big enough, can be fatal for a startup like ours. Yeah. So I don't know if you encountered successful leaders being able to balance the two.
All the time. And the question that I ask is, how do you do both? Right? So that agility is required to keep the business moving. And you're thinking about those things and you're changing and you're pivoting quickly in a way that needs to be deliberate. Right? So how do we take and move the needle in a way that drives a thoughtfulness, a communication, and behaviors and actions that come from it that then can also quickly pivot? right? So what is the plan? If I've got the pivot, what is the plan to execute on that pivot? And then who is reinforcing and requiring me to look up and pivot again when required? And then what's the plan? So it's about the reconciling of the both.
But to be successful with that plan, what I've seen help is defining where you will be agile and where you can't be. Right. Because again, sometimes you can't be agile in everything in order to be deliberate. So it's defining where you can and can't be agile and making sure then you're able to be deliberate where you want to be. So to Lacey's point, you can define that in the plan, and then it's not hidden. Everybody's aligned. These are the areas where we need to be agile, and these are areas where we've aligned we can't be at this time.
Yeah. I mean, I think of it as the captain or the person steering the wheel of a big ship. You can't be going like this, right?
No.
On a big ship. And because you can be doing this if you're driving, one of those, water scooters or whatever. But that's different, right? You can do that, but not when you're driving a massive oil tanker or whatever, and that to me, it's deliberate, but you also have to be agile because you have these storms heading your way, in a metaphorically speaking.
The best agile leaders I have engaged with, some of the words that when you go out and you talk to people and you do a 360, people say are consistent. They're consistent. And you're like, that's interesting because the business is sort of making all of these changes and moving quickly, right? But they're perceived as consistent. Yeah. And that's because they're steering the ship in a way that doesn't feel like everybody's getting whiplash, right? But they're making the business changes that are needed to stay alive or make that next change or do that thing. But they're doing it in a way that is consistent in terms of how they do it, how they communicate it, how they roll it out. Everything's on fire.
Step by step, not huge leaps.
It's not like, oh, come with me today and come with me tomorrow and here's the fire and we got to go deal with this. It's consistent.
Very methodical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a couple of the paradoxes in the book speak to this, but from two different angles. One is this idea of flexibility and focus. So in order to be successful at this, you've got to have the flexibility, or to use the term you used around agility, to recognize that almost no matter what plan you put in place to transform your business or yourself, somewhere along the way, it's going to go wrong. And so you have to assume that there's adjustment required along the way to make it happen, and build that into your set of assumptions rather than resist it and fight it or see it as a failure. It's actually kind of inevitable. But the other side of the coin is the idea of focus, knowing what steps have to come first, second, and third. How do you avoid constantly chasing shiny objects that seem cool and interesting to you, but may actually distract you from the general direction that you're trying to take yourself or take the organization? And that requires a certain amount of discipline, and organization and being consistent, like Lacey was talking about. And those two things seem inconsistent, which is why they're a paradox, right? But having the flexibility and the agility to know when you've got to pivot, but also staying true to a certain set of priorities and the order in which things need to happen and the general direction that you're heading is north, not east, those things are really important. The other one that kept jumping out at me was this idea of speed and flexibility, or speed and rhythm, I should say, because with speed, almost everybody will tell you that if you want to get traction on big change, you have to move faster than generally feels comfortable. And so, a lot of leaders typically feel like the change is moving too slowly. And a lot of the people who are the victims of or the recipients of the change, often feel like it's moving way too fast, right? So there's different perspectives on this. But here's the thing that I learned over and over again. Speed matters. However, because no leader is going to successfully lead change alone, they've got to bring other people along with them. And that's where the rhythm comes in. I'm a bit of a bad musician. I play a little bit of guitar. But one thing I know about music is that very few musicians will tell you just playing the song faster and getting to the end more quickly is going to improve the song. That's usually not the case. You've got to have a certain cadence, a certain rhythm, people playing in harmony, off the same sheet of music. Everybody knows what their contribution to the song is so that it comes out as beautiful music. Usually speed without rhythm is noise, not beautiful music. And so, getting everybody to come along with you, doing it at a certain pace and a certain rhythm is really important to getting the sort of speed that you might actually need to get traction.
But I think another part of that, Ian, is the constantly checking the pulse of where things are, right? Because again, you pivot too far one way or back the other way. Where's the organization with you, right? So you're working on getting these advocates, you're working on bringing the organization along, but how do you check the pulse on a regular basis so that they're actually following and not going the opposite way, right? So constantly we've heard from these leaders, and we see it in our own, quest for transformation, is that you have to constantly check in and see the pulse and see where things are.
Yeah, and so one thing that was you guys did was doing a survey. What were some of the key takeaways from that survey that you got from a lot of people about the actions and steps that were most important for transformational change?
Yeah, I'll chime in with one, and then I want everybody to build off this because they've already mentioned it, but maybe we can go a little deeper. One of the first themes that came through loud and clear was this idea of go first, but not alone. In other words, that, leaders setting the tone, being a role model, transforming themselves before expecting other people to change, all really matters a lot, but there's really very little evidence that successful transformational change is done by one person, who's the leader. Generally, you've got to surround yourself with people who can help you make it happen. And my way of describing it in the book is, leaders of transformational change travel in packs. They're doing it, with and around a lot of other people. And that was a very powerful theme that came through over and over. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
I was just on this theme of pace, right? So in some ways, you can't go so fast you're going alone. But if you go too slow, you lose the momentum and you don't get the organization go where you need. A lot of it, you talk in the book about go slightly faster than you think is comfortable, but obviously be checking in with the organization to make sure you're bringing a critical mass of people along with you. And that is an art, not a science. I mean, we can put all the frameworks and assessments, but there's a level of just good judgment and experience and intuition that also comes into play with the leaders leading through transformational change on that pace.
Yeah. And I would just break that down into both what you and Ian said. I was just breaking that down into slightly, not necessarily behavioral, but slightly more behavioral. It's, these people are accountable, right? They're accountable to themselves. They're accountable to the organization. They're accountable to the board or whoever is helping drive the change. These people are comfortable listening and hearing because they've got this great group of people. They're not alone. They're accountable. They stop, they hear, and then they're super comfortable with being wrong.
Right. I want to go to a second learning from the survey, and I think it was pretty prevalent in many of the responses was the need for iteration. And that means like define, align, refine, the why and the what. Like, don't just put the stake in the ground and not be ready to define, align, refine it, because as the organizational learns and you head toward transformation, those that are successful recreate and realign to what needs to happen, because as you learn, you need to be flexible, you need to communicate and listen to what's going on, or you might again have a paradigm of the reality versus again the aspiration. So continually the feedback was that reiteration is critical in order to get the goals and reinforce the behaviors.
Yeah,
so
and I think
another one.
And I'm guessing, I'm making an assumption here, but for all of us in all of our work, when we've seen transformation not take root, it's because that stake has been put in the ground. The agility, I think we were all talking about, the openness, the trust, all of those things aren't there. And someone isn't speaking the truth, or someone's not hearing it.
Yeah.
Right? That
Which
stake
also
is there and it
highlights
doesn't come in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Humility to admit. I mean, again, I'll be honest. I thought I was ahead on some of these curves than I now realize after 2020 unfolded, right? In terms of how I show up as a DEI champion and how I adjust to transformational change that's hitting home, right? Like in a real way. And so it's just the humility, which I think goes into the iteration. You try something, you move things forward, you adjust, but it starts with the leader. It starts with the people taking the group through it. And even the experts, if they're good, are going to learn and grow, as every new challenge is presented.
Yeah.
And it's really hard. You won't have momentum or maintain momentum if that leader's not walking the talk. If it's just a bunch of talk, it's not going to work, right? So the leader has to demonstrate and be a role model.
Yeah, and I think that just translates over so many different aspects of life and work and all of those components. Whether you're leading a team, coaching a team of kids' youth sports, leading or volunteering on a not-for-profit board, just across the board, those are the realities of when we get ourselves into trouble and when leaders get themselves into trouble. Right, a stake in the ground because we're so concerned with being right that we're missing the messages coming our way, whether it's from 10-year-olds, a not-for-profit board, or your COO.
Right.
And again, Lacey, that's another dynamic tension in this of, in some ways, you need to stand your ground and have passion. And when everyone's telling you you're wrong or this can't happen, you're the one that gives that confidence without standing your ground when you shouldn't, and in the wrong ways that does harm. So, it's just like that pace. It's so important to get right. How rigidly you're going to stand your ground or not is so important to get right. And it looks different in different situations.
Yeah,
again,
I think
that's where this judgment comes in.
And that's why we started the conversation out by saying this is all really quite hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it was easy, we wouldn't need the book.
Right.
I think it's pretty impressive you got that many people contributing to the book with interviews and authors, different perspectives. So this actually would be a great read for a lot of readers who are looking to make transformational change. Now, the last chapter in the book, it's a word I can't say, but it's called pizza analogy. And what the F does pizza have to do with leading transformational change? So what is it?
Yeah, so let's explore this a little bit. I started thinking about the examples out there in the world where if you took the path of tradition and longevity, you could be fairly easily lulled into a false sense of security that not much needs to change, either about your life or your business or your organization. And pizza jumped out at me as a pretty good example of this. So let's, roll back for a minute to 997 AD when pizza was thought to be invented in Gaeta, Italy. And kind of fast forward from there and think about an industry and a food that has now become kind of ubiquitous. One of the interesting little factoids that I picked up in all of this was I mistakenly believed that on a per capita basis, the United States was most likely the place with the highest pizza consumption in the world. Turns out that's not true. It's actually Norway. And so, you realize that, you can find pizza, almost anywhere. However, pizza is really no longer pizza. If you think about it in terms of the shapes and sizes and toppings and cheeses and crusts and ways that it's prepared and the access outlets from, where you would get a pizza, not to mention all of the secret sauces that, go on top of pizza, it's been a constant reinvention, reimagination, repositioning of the food and the industry over many, many, many years now in order to remain relevant to changing tastes and responsive to changing trends. And, the takeaway from this for me personally, as somebody who's a, staunch pizza lover, but also sees the transformation of the food and the industry, is the recognition that, assume nothing, because nothing really is going to stay the same to compete and survive. And there is this false sense of security that comes from looking at a traditional industry like pizza and assuming that because it's been loved for 1,000 years or more, somehow or another everything's great. Well, it turns out not so great. And one of my favorite quotes that popped out on all of this and putting the book together was believe in yourself, because if cauliflower can become pizza, you can become anything. And I'm not one who's much for the cauliflower crust, even though I know there's plenty of people out there who gravitated in that direction. I'm more of a traditionalist in that sense. But I really encourage anybody who's not only reading the book, but just thinking about change in their own organization, try to do your own assessment of what are the long-held traditions and comfort that comes from those traditions, in your own environment and organization, and recognize if you're not reimagining, reinventing, repositioning, rethinking those long-held conventions and traditions, there's a very high likelihood that the world is going to pass you by, because there are a lot of trends out there that we don't control. What we can control is our response to those trends that are pushing us to change. And pizza has been a really perfect example of that. And that's why we call it the pizza analogy and talk about it in the book.
Yeah. And does anybody else have anything to add to that?
Making cauliflower pizza for dinner tonight?
I'm not.
I was on a keto kick for a while, and I did
No, nobody tells that story better than Ian. There's nothing to add there. He's got it down.
The one thing, though, that I think it brings us back to the difference of this book versus other transformational books is a lot of them might have an author or 2 to 3 authors, but they focus on the what. And what this did is focused on all those important ingredients, the hows. And it really went from planning through execution to monitoring. It's the entire continuum of what's and hows. And it really helps people understand and recognize kind of how different industries, because we had finance, consumer goods, pharmaceutical, aerospace, lots of different contributors and different voices, as Ian said earlier. And so we have all these industries and professions bringing all these different ingredients to the table to create a different pizza than's ever been seen before. So it just plays out so well in terms of the secret sauce coming from so many different lenses to lead that transformational change. So that's what was really exciting as the book started to come together.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much academic out there that's so hard to get your arms around. And this book just feels real. When you read a chapter, you can almost even use it as a toolkit, right? So I'm going through this thing. I have this challenge. What is the right chapter that aligns with where I'm at right now?
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to build on that to say that in some ways it's sound bites. So you can read a couple pages at night before bed. You don't have to kind of commit to this long process. And so it builds, and a little bit, Lacey, what you were saying is I now have it tagged as a reference guide, where it's just, this piece is relevant, these aren't as much, and it becomes user manual reference guide depending on the situation.
Yeah.
Great. So where can they get the book? How do you buy it? Do you want to give a little?
Yeah, best way, one-stop shop. We have a book website dedicated to all of what you just mentioned, www.transformationalchangebook.com, where people can see some chapter summaries if they want to learn a little bit more about the contents of the book, also get some background bios on all of the contributing authors, a way of ordering the book at a discount through the publisher, also scheduling presentation or other types of conversations if they'd like to have those with us as a follow-on to all of this. It's also available on Amazon and a number of other sources, but want to make sure people are aware that they can get a 25% discount if they work directly through our website and our publisher, which is Routledge.
And this book is not just for leaders, right? It's for anybody who's aspiring to be a leader, the managers, the HR leaders as well. So it's not just meant for the CEO.
That's very much so. I mean, we wanted to make it as accessible and practical as possible, which is one of the reasons among several that we tried to keep it relatively short, compared to the 350 or 400 page book that many people have a tough time making the time to get through these days. So if you're, an individual, wrestling with change at your own personal level, or you're the manager of a few people on a team, or you're a more senior leader that's got a larger organization that you're trying to transform, we're probably a little bit biased, but I would say that there's something in there for everyone. I think everybody can benefit from some of the wisdom and nuggets that these, 200 people shared with us as we were piecing the book together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just profit organizations. I mean, other organizations, anywhere you're leading a team and you have a vision to go somewhere, and the reality is you're not at that vision, the principles are applicable. So nonprofits or even, other organizations that, again, need to drive change.
Yeah. I mean, I am part of a nonprofit, board member at Cinema for St. Louis, which puts on the St. Louis International Film Festival and all the different film festivals. And boy, that got hit hard during COVID, right? People stopped going to movie theaters, and there was a time where we were trying to figure out how to survive this COVID period and get to the other side. And we're actually a stronger organization for that. I can't take the credit. I was just one of the many board members, but there were some really good, strong leadership in our team that helped us navigate through that. So nonprofits equally, and sometimes more so, because they're running such a tight ship most of the time, especially if you get your donors pull back, your funding from government pull back, you have to be able to still survive and thrive. Great. If anybody has any questions on the attendees, feel free to add into the chat. So while I wait for some of the questions, I do have a broad question, right? I mean, you've observed the transformational change across many organizations, talking to many leaders, interviewing people. And maybe I'm going to put you on the spot, but has anybody or any organization stood out for each of you that these guys did a great job, and what they did that made them so successful?
Anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the ones that stood out a lot was Con Ed, because they're such a huge organization. And they, again, a leader had a vision. That leader immediately brought on, 12 champions through all levels of the organization, kind of got the top down as well as bottoms up. So they did, grassroots efforts as well as top down leadership efforts, because it takes both. And then now have successfully, 5 years later, continued to evolve beyond the aspiration to new aspirations. So Con Ed was one that definitely stuck out, through the efforts that I went through.
I would build on that. I think, as you said, grassroots. True Green has really invested heavily in their top 200 associates to be able to pivot and be present and be strong leaders. And I think, top 200 at many organizations, but top 200 at a organization True Green size has a ripple effect through the entire culture, and it has the potential for a ripple effect through the entire culture and company. So they've done a good job. Kind of, we were talking about earlier of, if leaders are able to handle their direct reports, there's a much different outcome in a lot of these change and other initiatives than if it's just coming from the top of people who've spent a lot of time focusing on learning these skills.
I'll just use an example that might be very unexpected, but one of our essays was focused on the CEO of a local financial institution in Hawaii, and the whole story was basically centered around the beginning of a transformation of a relatively small financial institution, but during a period of time of natural disaster in Kauai, when it started raining and rained for several weeks straight, and it was flooding all throughout the island. And basically the conversion that this organization made from, worrying first and foremost about, how to make loans to people, to focusing on how to help people survive in the community, literally, delivering food and water and other supplies to people when the roads were all washed out and all the rest, and how it actually changed the entire image and actually created a brand for this organization when it was a very low-key, not particularly well-known institution prior to this natural disaster. So it was, what really impressed me was understanding the circumstances as they were, back to our earlier conversation about defining reality, but having the agility at the time to focus on what mattered most to people, which was, in this case, surviving as human beings and being able to feed your family and get medical supplies and all the rest, and how that, in fact, has transformed and repositioned this business as a much better known and well-respected brand locally within Hawaii because of the actions that they took that were not really part of their core business, but it was because it was part of their core mission in the community. And so if you think about it as a small community credit union, to be able to have made the pivot almost overnight to be able to address that really impressed me, despite all the big company stories that we also write about in the book.
That's a great example of the vulnerability moments we were talking about. You show up that way in that moment, people use your brand a few years later when things settle.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, excellent. We are out of time. So thank you so much, Team Ian, Rebecca, Cheryl, and Lacey. I really, really appreciate your time. I think this was a very wonderful conversation. A lot of good takeaways here. The recording will be available for everybody who signed up to the webinar, so and the ones who showed up. So it'll always be there for eternity, as long as, I guess, YouTube and internet is there. So anyway, thank you again, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you
for having us.
Thanks for the attendees.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.